And we are back, Daru Strong Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Daru. Today I have my man, Conor Harris. He is a strength and conditioning coach, but a PRI specialist. The kid knows his stuff when you're talking about movement, biomechanics, and teaching the body how to move like a true human and integrating that into the weight room. So we have a great talk on that, so make sure you listen up. But before we do that, I have to shout out the sponsors, Athletic CBD. Go check them out, athleticcbd.com. Use the discount code DARU. You get your CBD to get you back ready to play and ready to perform. Also, Vivo Barefoot. You guys know the shoes that I've been wearing on my YouTube channel. You ask me all the time. These are the shoes. VivoBarefoot.com. Go check them out. I highly recommend them. A minimalistic shoe to help you stay functional, but also increase performance. Now, let's get on to the podcast.
Welcome to the Daru Strong Podcast. Daru Strong Podcast.
Let's go. Mind over matter. Put your mind somewhere else and keep going. That little voice in your head is trying to stop you from getting to where you want to be. Be successful and keep moving forward.
With your host and world-renowned strength and conditioning coach, Phil Daru.
Obviously, my name is Conor Harris. I started off as, just like I feel like a lot of people do, as a personal trainer. And I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to take the direction of my career, but I knew I was in the right field. It was just a matter of finding the right thing. So I think, again, just like when you start off in strength and conditioning, being like a personal trainer on the side, you kind of want to work with the best elite athletes. And from there, that was kind of my goal. So I kind of liked working in the athletic setting. The college strength conditioning setting was really appealing to me. So I ended up pursuing that pretty hard for a couple of years, did some internships while I was in undergrad for the Oregon State sports performance teams. And I ended up working with the baseball team, basketball, track, pretty much everything. And that was a great experience, but it just, at the end, I realized it wasn't quite the environment I was looking for because, you know, with college S&C, there's a lot of low pay, high hours, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but I saw myself working in more of a private sector. So what I ended up doing was taking an internship with a company called Exos, who does some performance training. I'm more of like the private side of things. And that was a great experience, but there was just something else that was calling me and I wasn't quite sure what it was, but I had done an internship previously that was very much based around sports performance training using PRI or postural restoration principles. And I found it to be the most engaging and appealing thing to me. So I just figured, well, man, I kind of want to pursue this and see where it goes, because I didn't really know a ton about it at the time. So I ended up moving to North Carolina and I ended up doing some work there in the high school strength conditioning setting, but more so I was there to learn as much as I can and just see how I can apply it to different populations. And then from there, I moved back to Oregon, and then I was going to open up my own facility, and then COVID happened 2 weeks later. So that was a lot of fun. But I think because of that, I've had to transition to doing online because Oregon is extremely, as we touched on earlier, it's extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? We're just very serious about COVID. So it's hard to, and it's probably the worst possible time to open up a spot in Portland, but I do plan on it in the future. But until then, you just got to sink or swim. So I'm doing online.
How old are you, by the way?
I'm 25.
25. Oh, you're young, man. You got time. Don't worry. I opened up my first facility after I got out of college, and I was actually a professional fighter too at the same time. But I opened up at like 22 years old, and so like it was a little bit young for me. I didn't even know anything about business at the time. So I mean, you're well on your way. You have a good head on your shoulders, and you have some experience too to back it. So once you have the ability to make sure that you can get that gym, you'll be up and running pretty soon. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries.
You.
Oh, no worries, man. So let's talk a bit about PRI, right? What is it? How does it help an athlete? You know, what have you seen it help with, and go on from there.
Yeah, so PRI is really, it's a physical therapy modality. So it was never really originally meant to be for strength conditioning, but it's really just about the human body, and it's about how we are naturally asymmetrical by nature. So just by being a human, I think we can all agree we have a heart on the left side of our body, a liver on the right side of our body. And because of that and the way our diaphragm is asymmetrically shaped, we tend to have a lot of just general asymmetrical presentations within our skeleton and our skeletal position in our joints. The most common ones and most popular ones being a pelvis that is oriented to the right, with the left half of the pelvis more forward as we sit in our right hip more, and a shoulder on the right that is lower, because as we sit in our right hip, we don't want to walk in a circle to the right. So we want to even ourselves out. So we counter rotate our trunk back to the left, and then our right shoulder ends up being a little bit lower. That's the base. And then there's obviously more complicated compensations that happen from there. But my interest in it is applying it in more of a performance setting, and also a rehabilitative setting to the extent which I can. And just kind of using that as my lens, because it's just humans. Like, we're just working with humans. And if you understand that you're just working with a person, then you can kind of see what these common compensation patterns are and positions to put people in to help them get out of it. Ultimately, we're never going to win the battle of asymmetry because we were born biased into our right sides, even if you are left-handed, but we can at least manage it.
Gotcha. So what are the common asymmetries that you're actually seeing with athletes and just general people when they come to see you, or if you're assessing them online or something like that?
Yeah, I find that people like to sit into the right side a little bit more. So, for example, when I was in North Carolina, we had a force plate. So we would put athletes on the force plate and then have them see their weight distribution between their feet when they're doing something like a squat or a deadlift or whatever, some bilateral lower body exercise. And what you would see almost every single time is people having more weight on their right heel and more weight on their left toes, because the left side is forward. So just naturally, by being in that position, the right heel is going to take more load. So you'll see them squat down. And then once you can add some tempo to it, maybe to make it a little bit more challenging. Once they start to get tired, they'll shift their pelvis and their hips to the right. And then that's just a representation of them being able to shift into their right side more. So they're just finding the path of least resistance to get up out of that squat. And they're using their left side, their left forefoot and quad to help propel them into that right side. You'll see that a lot. And even in something like a push-up, you would see them lean into their right side a little bit more, which is also interesting. But ultimately, it's just helping people understand that this is how things tend to be unless you have additional compensations. And I found a force plate and literally showing them the objective data was the best way to do that.
Yeah, so like, let's say for instance, you got a new guy, new coach, doesn't have the funds for a force plate. How would you go about assessing them from a movement perspective? Do you do anything like FMS or something along the lines of that? And then also, I do want you to talk a little bit about, and we can go further on, but expansion and compression biases.
Yeah. So when it comes to not having a force plate, which most people honestly don't, so I would probably have them face their back towards me and then have them do some sort of tempo squat, and then have them go to where things really start to suck. And then you see them start to shift towards one side or the other. It's usually the right. And then just show them that, draw a line down their body with like a coaching eye tool app or something like that. And then they just see it. And if you record them under stress, you can start to see these compensations come up more and more, because the body reverts to what it feels comfortable doing, which is sitting in the right side a lot of the times. And that's not always what it is. It's not like, I'm not trying to be so reductionist to the point where it's like, well, every human is like this, right? Like, there are differences. And I think it's important to appreciate that. But the other point of your question, can you remind me? Sorry, I was on a tangent. What was the other half of your question right there?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about expansion and compression and how you identify that too as well, because I've seen some videos and I've been actually using a lot of those techniques based off of what Kyle Dobbs has been, integrating in with my own training. Obviously, I work with Kyle. I don't know if you know who Kyle is, but
Yeah.
Compound Performance, yeah. So I've had him on in the past, and also and Matt Domley. So go ahead and talk a little bit about that and how you can assess it, but also integrate it into the training process after you go ahead and assess that situation.
For sure. Yeah. So I think it's like defining expansion and compression. I think people look at it, generally speaking, the same way. So expansion is what most people refer to as inhalation. So when we inhale, that's an expansive strategy. Expansive strategies are usually biased towards external rotation, abduction, and external rotation. So flexion, abduction, external rotation. When we exhale, our body tends to be biased towards the joint actions of internal rotation, adduction, and extension. So these joint actions are usually coupled with one another within our rib cage, our pelvis, so on and so forth. So usually you have people that are biased towards one or the other. And I think it's something we've always known. We're just now labeling it differently. Like you can look at someone and say, you're probably a better power lifter than you are a marathon runner, and vice versa for different body types. So generally speaking, if you imagine a big spectrum, imagine on one end of the spectrum is a big, heavy powerlifting dude. And on the other end is a small, thin marathon running female. The narrows are going to be more on the female marathon running side, and the people that are more compressed or biased towards exhalation are going to be more towards the other end of the spectrum. And in reality, most people live somewhere on that spectrum. It's not a black and white thing. And usually compensations occur that help you find what you don't have. So for example, if I'm someone biased towards internal rotation, my body's going to find a way to get that external rotation, and vice versa. So when we talk about expansion and compression, we're talking about expansion, inhalation, compression, exhalation. And then that reflects certain joint positions. And because of those joint positions and genetic biases, we tend to be biased towards one or the other.
Gotcha. So now talking about sports in like asymmetrical fashions, like I got a lot of fighters that they're bladed. So you have one side of the body that may be more compression biased and the other side may be more expansion biased, or basically stating, one side's going to have more external rotation, the other side's going to have more internal rotation. Would you find that do you want to balance out those asymmetries, or would that be detrimental to their game? And I know we ride that fine line of like making sure that they have the abilities to do their sport, but also mitigating the risk of injury down the line because of those asymmetries may get too compensated in a sense. What do you think there would be the approach from a guy like myself working with these athletes that have those asymmetries?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think just watching MMA fighters, if you ever watch them, they usually have their left foot forward more, which is interesting when they're in that staggered stance. Rarely do you see one with the right foot forward more, but when you do see that, oftentimes I haven't worked with a bunch of fighters myself, but I've worked with a couple, and I find the ones that have the right foot forward more, those actually tend to be pretty skilled fighters, at least in my limited experience. So
you're right.
When I see
you're right. I like you because I'm a southpaw and my foot's right. So there we go. I knew I liked him. I knew I had him on it for a reason. See what I'm saying?
Research. I was holding that one back pocket.
Yeah.
So I think that's a reflection of why people are comfortable with that left pelvis forward, the left foot's forward. So that could just be a position of comfort, but there's also things that go into it. Like maybe they were just taught that, maybe it's as simple as that. And that's just what it is. And then, those asymmetries can become further exaggerated over time. So I think, like I mentioned earlier, you're never going to win the battle with asymmetry, but there are instances and many compensations that happen when the pelvis or the body in general gets too asymmetrical, because the body tries to find what it doesn't have. So for example, the right side, which is biased towards internal rotation, adduction and extension, or compression. The left side is biased towards external rotation, abduction and flexion, or expansion. Then we're going to seek strategies to help us find those missing joint actions. And that can happen in a variety of different ways. A lot of the times it happens via the pelvis just dumping forward and going into an anterior pelvic tilt. You see that a lot because the human body is trying to go forward. We're trying to survive, reproduce, and we're trying to go forward a lot. Those are the three main things pretty much everyone wants to do. So if we can't go forward naturally, through the just basic joint positions and actions we should have, we're going to find a way to do it through the path of least resistance. And that usually involves an extension pattern and anterior pelvic tilt. Now, because of that, that's sort of a bilateral compensation, but underneath the surface, you still have these asymmetries. So if I have someone that's extremely asymmetrical, there can be a point where it's a red flag, where let's say I'm testing their range of motion and this person has, I don't know, like double or, over 2 times the amount of internal rotation on one side than the other. Then at that point, I'm going to start to be a little bit concerned, but it also depends on the context of what type of athlete I'm working with and how asymmetrical do they need to be, because a baseball pitcher needs to be extremely asymmetrical, whereas a fighter maybe needs to be a little bit less so because they need to be good on both sides. So I want to seek to restore the ability for that person to access those joint actions that they're missing on both sides in a non-compensatory manner. But I also don't want to get them so far out of their pattern that it takes them away from being a good athlete, because extension is power production. Extension is how people basically excel at athletics. That's why so many great athletes have a huge anterior pelvic tilt. You know, their back extensors are just crazy well developed, and that's totally normal. I don't think we should call that bad, because, you know, it's a common theme, pretty much universal across sports. So what I will generally do is look at what kind of an athlete is this, and then I will create an in-season and out-of-season sort of goals list for what we want this person to look like. When someone's in season, they need to play their sport, they need to lift to excel at their sport, and they need to basically stay in their pattern. If I took them out of their pattern or out of what makes them a great athlete in season, that would be probably pretty detrimental, because now they're going to have to self-organize all their skills and body around an entirely new skeletal position that's unfamiliar to them. Whereas out of season, that person can probably afford to get more variability. They can probably afford to, you know, take their foot off of the gas of pushing themselves all of the time. So in that point, I would probably want to restore more variability, take them out of their pattern a little bit more. And then as you get, it's like periodization, right? As you get closer to the competition, then you want to start getting them geared for where they need to be. But I find having that balance of how much of this extension pattern or whatever you're leveraging to excel at your sport, how much of it do we really want to keep? And then I will have specific, tangible range of motion, assessment, whatever goals to maintain in season. And if they dip below that threshold, then I will probably start to want to get those back a little bit more.
Gotcha. Yeah, so for me, working with the athletes that I work with, they're more along the lines of compression bias. But like you said, in season, out of season, we really don't have seasons, right? You either got a guy that's, you know when the fight is going to happen and we have about 8 to 12 weeks to get ready for it, or most of the time, especially for coaches that work with combat sport athletes, we really don't know when they're going to fight, and they're always training the specific demands of the sport, because skills training is ever flowing. It's omnipresent throughout the year. So what I decided to do, and actually watching some of your videos, go ahead and check out, I would say, Connor, go make sure you go check out Connor's YouTube too. By the way, he needs to get his subscribers up. I'm gonna go ahead and help you out right now, Connor. We're gonna get him up, man. I promise. Because you do have a lot of great information, man. I was on it for like 3 hours, I think, the other night, man. So yeah, I was stalking you. All right, I was stalking you. All right, you got a nice little comb over. It looks awesome. I was stalking you. But shit, I forgot where I was going with that one. But what I decided to do was, when the goal is force production, when the goal is to maximize our strength, right? I'm going to put them in their bias, right? I'm going to put them in whatever they need to do to elicit a strength response, because it is the most simplistic form of what we need to do from an adaptation standpoint. Then after that, however, from an accessory standpoint, I was thinking about going in, let's say, for instance, they are compression bias. We work more of that expansion bias techniques, right? Or I should say expansion focus, right? We work more expansion focus, you know, whether it be a front foot elevated or whatever. You know, we want to make sure that I'm taking them out of there and actually working on those muscles around the year so that they can sustain outputs, get more progression in their sport, but also, again, we're getting the adaptations that we want to from a strengths perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And if I had someone, a fighter, an athlete, where they were year round like that and it was a little bit unpredictable, I think that would be a very good way of doing it. I would say have your tangible goals that you want to maintain all year round, or maybe X weeks out from a competition or whatever. But yes, using the primary lifts as the get after it, we're really going to, drive some adaptations here, high output, and then fill in the accessory exercises with more of what you're describing, that would be extremely beneficial for that person. That would help restore a little bit of variability. So that way, once they get off of the platform with their heavy deadlift, squats, whatever, then they can go get out of that heavy extension pattern and then leave the gym feeling a little bit better, as opposed to leave the gym extremely compressed. But also, I think the unilateral work is so important because, how often do how often do you throw a punch or a kick with two legs? You don't. So there's got to be a little bit of specificity as well. So when we do unilateral exercises, we're compressing one side of the body and expanding the other. One side is going into certain joint actions. The opposite side is probably going into the opposite. And that's exactly what reciprocal alternating movement is. If I throw a punch with my right hand and my right hand is going into internal rotation, my shoulder is as well, then my left is going to be going into external. So that's why I think the unilateral thing is so important too, because you're getting exactly that. And if you're only training bilateral compressive exercises, which again are not a bad thing at all, I love them, use them all the time. If we only did bilateral activities, we would be teaching the body to do the same thing on both sides of the body at the same exact time. And I don't personally believe that has the greatest amount of carryover to the sport, although it is fantastic for driving a high potential output.
100%, 100%. And I mean, there's other factors too as well. From a biomechanics standpoint, reciprocity, reciprocation, gait mechanics, that's important. That's how the body actually is supposed to move. So I do like it. I do a lot of unilateral work, especially for our accessories. And even sometimes I'll even do it if a person is very efficient, right? I do have an athlete that's been with me for a while, and I can put them in that single legs or a split stance and then do some maximal lifts with them. I'll do that too, only if they have the prerequisites to do so. But I do like that. And I seen a video that you did with all weight training, or all weightlifting is gait training?
Training is gait training?
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
So that was basically a webinar that I did to promote my biomechanics program, but it was just basically a sort of a snippet of it. And the idea is that when you're in the weight room, whether you're cognizant of it or not, you're always mimicking the gait cycle in one way or another. And you could be doing it well, or you could be doing it not so well. And neither is necessarily right or wrong. It's just like, what is your goal, right? So it's a lens to look through weight training, because depending on the position of your body, you're going to be in a specific phase of gait. So for example, and the easiest way to think about it is through a shin angle. So think about your shin, your lower leg. When you take a step forward, when you're in heel strike, your shin is pointing backwards. It's more negative. And then when you're in mid stance, when you're in the second third of the gait cycle, your shin is vertical and it's completely upright. That's when you have all your weight on that leg. And then when you push off with your toe, then you're going to be in more of a positive or forward shin angle. So for example, and a really easy way to describe this would just be doing a narrow split stance. Feet pretty close together, and you do a split squat. Well, what happens is you go down. You could also do this in a rear foot elevated position too. You're going to bias a positive shin angle. So because of that, you're going to be mirroring the late stance or toe off mechanics of gait, which is concentric, or just basically the muscles that are going to be active there are your glutes, your quads, and you're also going to be getting the pelvic orientation that mimics what happens in late stance. So for example, someone who's very compressive and they don't have a ton of compensations, they're going to be biased towards more of that mid and late stance. So if I had someone that was biased towards mid stance and I wanted to give them more variability, I wanted to give them the ability to access that external rotation because they're so biased towards internal rotation, because that's what the definition of compression we're using right now is. I would want to get them towards more of that negative shin angle. I would want them to be more biased towards heel strike. So I might elevate their heels on some plates, and then think about doing a split squat position, but think about having either a very wide stance or think about just elevating your front heel. That's going to bring your shin, your tibia, into more of a negative angle. And then as you go down, your tibia and shin can only translate so far. So you're going to be placing a constraint on your body to keep you in what we call that phase of gait. But it's really ultimately just skeletal positions. And then the outcome is the muscular function. It's not like it's your body knows it's heel strike and it's going into, heel strike. It's just, this is a pelvic and lower leg position that mimics heel strike. Therefore, you're going to get the joint actions and muscular orientation associated with it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's mimicking in a lot of ways when you're looking at fighters in general, and even like grapplers and wrestlers, when they're going for a deep single or a deep double, like going for a double leg takedown, that deep shin angle is where they're going to be at, that positive shin angle. So they're training a lot of that. Now, like we talked about, if we can get them out of that compression and then working on that expansion and maybe get that, what we would say a negative shin angle, right? Where they're actually maybe even doing like a box squat in a sense. For me, I've been doing that a lot lately because I do see that from the posterior chain perspective, like hamstrings, glutes, we don't have a lot of that, because they are compression biased and they work in those zones and more, I would say with that positive shin angle, they're always there driving the quads. Right. So we got to balance that out a little bit. One, if you're looking at it from like a takedown perspective, you're using the posterior chain. You get in a deep single and you go high crotch and then you have to lift. Well, now it's almost like a Zercher squat, right? So, it just depends on the positioning. And I think that if you understand the biomechanics of a sport, that it can transition, especially if you know the body in its entirety. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think with the, I think people can look at that and say, well, if I'm really biased towards, doing a lot of propulsive activity like toe off, don't I need a ton of rear foot elevated split squats in that position? I would say that's going to be really helpful. But like you mentioned, it's important to think about what you're not getting. So if you're doing a lot of stuff that pushes you forward, you might want to do some stuff that's going to pull you back, because when injuries occur, when the body starts to get overworked, that's when we have too much of one thing or too much of one thing too quickly.
Yeah, I wanted to transition a little bit because I've just recently had my ACL reconstructed. So I've been dealing with an ACL tear. I had the tear about, I want to say, a year and a half ago almost, and I finally got surgery on it 16 weeks ago. But at the moment now, I'm doing plyometrics. I'm back almost full go. It's been about 4 months. And that was because I set the baseline beforehand. I did a lot of prehab. So I was able to bounce back very quickly. But I have seen now, when we talked about shifting to the right, now my ACL tear was on the right side. So I've shifted more to the left based on an injury. Have you ever seen that happen? And it kind of takes away from like, all right, now everybody's right side dominant, but if they have an injury, they may have to transition over to the left side.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up. That's something that's pretty common with people who have had a significant injury to the right side. Most commonly ACL tears and severe ankle sprains, because the body doesn't want to trust the right side, but it wants to be in it. So what it wants to do then is shift over to the left, as you touched on. But the problem is that, if you're over the age of 18, you've gone through puberty and all that, then your body is comfortable being where it is, So if you then tell it, wait, you can't do this anymore because you don't trust it, unconsciously or consciously, then you're going to try and shift to a side that you were never very good at. And now you're not really good at getting in either hip. And then what goes on from there is your body's just going to, again, find the path of least resistance. So oftentimes those people will push over to the left, but then they don't want to be in the left. So then they just try to push back to the right. And it's just like, it's just imagine like a bunch of gears shifting, or like a Jenga stack, right? If you take one of those blocks out, then you're gonna have one side collapse and a little bit of it still standing. So I think with those types of people, sometimes you get to the point where it's like, well, maybe I do want you to get back into your right side, because it's not like the right side's bad and the left side is good. Like getting in the right side's bad and getting the left side's good. It's not like that at all. It's the goal is to get into each side and be able to get out of each side. So I would probably do a lot of things with you that would help shift you into the right, but also stuff that will help you get out of it and shift into the left, because the goal is get in, get out, and do it again.
Yeah, gotcha. So we talked about expansion and compression strategies. Can you talk a little bit about like how the body works? And I know you did it was like a tutorial video on biotensegrity. And if you can explain a little bit more on that, because that was interesting to me, watching you explain more on that perspective from like a fascial line, or fascial lines, I should say.
Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So with the body, the quickest way or the most efficient way to get from one point to the next is a straight line. It's not always the quickest, but it's usually the most efficient, just for the purposes of this example. So nature, it wants to conserve the most amount of energy for the most amount of results, right? So we want to spend the least amount of calories, most amount of results. So if we are nature, we want to form a lot of straight lines. So we do that. And then the most efficient makeup of a straight line in a two-dimensional sphere, according to the biotensegrity theory, is a triangle. If you take that into 3 dimensions, it then turns into a tetrahedron. And then if you stack a bunch of tetrahedrons and pyramids together, another way to think about it is just like a pyramid, stack a bunch of pyramids together, you end up getting a helix every single time. No matter how you stack them, it's going to end up looking like a helix. And then if you stack 2 helixes together, what do you have? You have a double helix. A DNA is a double helix. And this is starting at like the very roots. But if you look at in my program, I talk, one of the first slides I show is this picture from like a 1985 textbook. And it's showing actin and myosin, which is, you know, what makes up our muscles. Actin and myosin are helical. They literally look like a double helix wrapped around each other. And then if you understand that that's what makes up muscles, then muscles don't contract from, you know, linearly like this. They don't come together and spread apart in a straight line. They twist and they rotate together. And joints twist and rotate. Even in like a bicep curl, your joints are twisting and rotating to flex your elbow. And that's just a fact. Like that's how they rotate. So really there is no straight lines. There's not many straight lines happening. They look like straight lines, but they're a result of rotation. So that's why when we talk about expansion and compression, we usually talk about it's an external rotation strategy or it's an internal rotation strategy. The idea of a sagittal plane, a frontal plane, they make sense and I think they're beneficial, but everything happens in a transverse plane way, even down to the, you know, DNA.
Yep. No, that's interesting because we kind of, I mean, like you said, we live in a transverse plane, and even with sport, with rotation being the main emphasis on power production and creating torque, like you need to know these things and you need to be able to train them appropriately. When you train an athlete, let's say you say you work with baseball guys, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're looking to enhance like their hitting mechanics, or not even the mechanics in general, but their biomechanics of what they need to do to hit a ball, what are you looking at from a general perspective? You know, because you are more for general prep. What are you looking at to enhance from a quality perspective of their biomechanics?
Yeah. So if I've got, let's just take hitting a baseball as an example. So in order to effectively transition your weight from one side to the other and, you know, have a good swing path, you need to be able to shift into your back hip. You've got to be able to do that. In order for that to happen, you've got to have your pelvis move over your femur, your leg bone in a certain way, in internal rotation. So that's got to occur. And in order for you to propel out of that side, you've got to be able to push out of that hip too. So that goes back to what I was saying earlier about get in, get out, and do it on both sides. So if you can't shift into your back hip to begin with, for me, I'm a lefty, so that would be my left hip. Then I'm going to really struggle to then do what I'm really good at with the left side and push out of it. Let's take a normal right-hander. They're going to shift into their right hip, but oh wait, they can't really get out of that right hip. So they're going to struggle to get out of it and then push more of their weight and then get that swing path where they can make a nice connection with the ball. So what I'm looking at is can you even get into either hip? Because if you can't, then everything we're going to be doing with the nitty gritty details of your swing and whatever your swing coach is doing with you, it's probably not going to be as effective as if you could actually shift in and out of your pelvis. And if you could dissociate your thorax from your pelvis and also use it in unison, these things are really important. So it's really about, do you even have step one, the ability to use your body in the way you want to use it to swing a baseball or throw a punch or throw a kick, whatever the case is. Because if you don't, then all the technique work in the world might not save you from the fact that you can't even get into the position your coach is asking you to.
Yeah, would you say that, working to disassociate a joint by joint would be the first line of defense when you're talking about putting it all together? You know what I mean? From a movement perspective.
What do you mean by that?
So like, let's say for instance, I want to be able to optimally move in that transverse plane. Do I want to maximize my mobility of my hips by, again, disassociating the hip from the spine and work in those ranges and get strong in those ranges, and then I can put it all together once we do something more higher dynamic, like a baseball swing?
I see what you mean. So I think the mobility. So have you ever heard the term proximal stability equals distal mobility? It's that right there. So if you have the ability to stabilize, and basically, because the idea of skeletal position dictates muscular function, let's think about the idea if your pelvis is stuck in a certain orientation. When it's forward, you're going to be biased towards internal rotation. Mm-hmm. So if I can't get out of that position, then I'm never going to be able to have the mobility, quote unquote, to get into external rotation effectively. So I can do all the pigeon stretches in the world. I can dissociate my ribs from my pelvis. But if I can't get out of that anterior orientation of my pelvis, then external rotation is going to have a hard time sticking. So I'm going to look at, where is this pelvis able to get into? Where is it not able to get into? And then using exercises or certain muscles, like for example, the hamstrings posteriorly tip the pelvis, bring that pelvis back into more of a neutral state will give you a ton more mobility than just kind of stretching your way into more mobility. Because at that point, like if your pelvis isn't in a good position and you're doing a bunch of mobility stretches, at what point is that actually good for you? And what point is that, like, what are you even stretching at that point is what I would ask. And where's that mobility coming from at that point?
Okay. So we're putting more emphasis on the pelvis in general when it comes down to overall movement control. How about the feet? Do you think that the feet play a big role in that to create torque and other angles like that?
I certainly do. Yeah. I think there's a lot of people look at it from a top down, pelvis down to feet, or a bottom up, feet up to pelvis. I think it's both, because the feet interact with the ground, which sets the stage for your pelvis. But if your pelvis can't accept what's going on at your feet, for example, if my left pelvis is forward, and if you remember way back when I was talking about the force plate example and how we tend to have more weight on our forefoot on our left, then if the pelvis position doesn't allow you to get more weight on your left heel for heel strike, then it's going to work both ways. So you're going to have the ground up, and then you're going to have your pelvis allowing that ground up, ground reaction force, which is then going to influence the rest of your skeleton orientation and your movement. So they both feed each other, and it's a relationship that's extremely hard to dissociate from one another.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you get a lot of guys that kind of get married into, it's all about the feet, or it's all about the diaphragm, it's all about the trunk, but I do see it go back and forth. And again, if you don't have optimal control in any of those joints, it doesn't matter what you do. It's going to be a cause for concern to begin with. But that's great, man. So as far as I know you do your webinars, you have a coaching course or a mentorship, right?
Yeah, I call it my Biomechanics program. It's basically aimed at, it doesn't have to be coaches, really just anyone who's interested in learning about the principles and model I use. And it's laid out over 12 weeks. And it's just basically like, this is the start. We start at biotensegrity, and then we go all the way into different case studies. And the goal is to improve movement and performance for both athletes and general population.
Perfect, man. Yeah, so you guys, make sure you go ahead and check that out. I'll put some links in the description too. Go ahead and tell them where they can find you at, Instagram, and then go ahead and shout out your YouTube too, man. Make sure you go ahead and subscribe to this man's YouTube channel.
So, so my YouTube is, I don't even know what my YouTube.
See, that's the first issue. That's the first issue right there.
If you look up my name, just Conor Harris, Conor, spelled like Conor McGregor, then you'll find my YouTube, no problem. My handle on both Twitter and Instagram is CONOR _ Harris, HARRIS, and then another underscore after that.
All right, man. So thanks again for blessing us with some knowledge. Hope everybody can take from it, and we'll talk soon. All right, just stay on real quick. I'm gonna just go ahead and close it out. Good. But thanks again for coming on, and hopefully we'll have you on again.
Yeah, man, I enjoyed that. Thank you.
All right.